Hi students, today we are going to learn about CPU. CPU stands for Central Processing Unit and is considered to be a brain of the computer. It contains all the circuitry necessary to process input, store data, and output results. As important it is, a computer can only function properly with CPU and other necessary hardware components. Whether it is a smartphone, laptop, calculator, or even a TV, all computers have a processor inside them. Many people call the system unit a CPU, but the CPU is actually a silicon chip inside the system unit, and each CPU has millions of transistors inside. With constant advancement of the technology, CPU manufacturers are able to place more transistors while keeping the physical size smaller. As a result, the form factor of the laptops, tablets, smartphones, and even TVs have become thinner and lighter without compromising the power. It is most likely you will not see a processor when you open a computer. That is because the processor produces heat, and as a result, some form of cooling component is placed on top of a processor. Example, on this picture, there is a heatsink and a fan combination over the processor. On most desktop computers and laptops, there is a special socket where the CPU sits. This means that you could interchange the CPU on these computers as long as it uses the same socket. However, on many mobile devices and some of the laptops being produced these days, the CPU is part of the motherboard and you will not be able to replace it. This type of circuitry, where the CPU is directly soldered onto the motherboard, is called System on Chip, or SoC for short. CPU has two main components, CU and ALU. CU stands for Control Unit. It decodes instruction into commands and directs all operations of the processor. Then we have ALU, Arithmetic Logic Unit. It executes all the commands and handles all mathematical and logical operations. Originally, CPUs were produced with a single processing core, but today, most CPUs produced comes with at least two cores. It means that even though there is only one physical CPU, the manufacturers were able to combine multiple CPUs into one, therefore increasing the number of instructions it can process at once. In the picture, you will see terms like dual core or times 2, quad core. There are 6 cores, 8 cores, 12 cores. There are many different. They are able to place multiple cores in one single CPU. In addition to the CPU socket and number of cores, there are two types of architectures CPU uses, 32-bit and 64-bit. Even though our syllabus doesn't require us to know the CPU architectures, it is important to know as you will not be able to run applications using 64-bit architecture on a 32-bit CPU. Another important aspect of a CPU is the speed. Speed of the CPU is measured in Hertz, named after the scientist Heinrich Rudolf Hertz, the first person to provide conclusive proof of existence of electromagnetic waves. Today, CPUs operate on gigahertz. Intel and AMD are the main providers of CPU for computers. Processors are usually updated every year or 2 years. Each upgrade or each update being called a new generation. Think about an iPhone being updated every year. Every updated iPhone has an updated processor. This goes for other devices. Currently, popular Intel CPUs are named i3, i5, i7, while AMD uses naming starting with Ryzen. So you'll see Ryzen 3, Ryzen 5, Ryzen 7. So to round up this video, we will look at some CPUs online and discuss some of the specifications. There are a few keywords I need you to remember or understand when you are searching for CPU. Socket type, number of cores, architecture, and the speed. I did a search on processor at Amazon, and this is what I got on my first two options. Right away, you can see that we spoke about earlier. The name of the processor tells us the brand, the model, the number of cores, and other information about the processor. The first option is from AMD. The model number is Ryzen 7 5700G. It has 8 cores. Below the name, we can see a brief summary of the processor. It has a price of $324.99 and the processor speed of 4.6 gigahertz, and it uses 64 watts. Then we have a processor from Intel, model number i7 9700K with a 3.6 gigahertz using LGA 1151 socket. This one costs 397 cents. It is also an octa-core or 8 cores. It draws 95 watts of power and the processor speed on the description says 4.9, but it says 3.6 in the name. It could be either a typographical error or the processor runs at 3.6 but could be boosted up to 4.9 gigahertz. And this time I run a search to buy a new laptop, and here are 3 items I saw on my first page. First laptop is from Dell, but I want to focus on the processor because that's our topic. And I can see that this laptop from Dell is configured with a 10th generation Intel processor, and the model number is i5 10210U. That's only information provided on the title. If you click on it, it will give you more in-depth information about the speed of the processor, the number of cores, etc. Second option is from HP, and it uses AMD Ryzen 3 CPU, and this title gives us more description of the CPU used by stating that it is a dual core. It has 2 cores. The last item is from Apple, and the processor it uses is called Apple M1 chip. We didn't speak about Apple CPUs, but it is good to know that there are many other CPU manufacturers apart from Intel and AMD. With this, we come to the end of the video, and I hope that by now you can understand some of the words, some of the terms they use in describing the processors.